And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. As you may be aware, Indiana is the first state in the nation to take up the issue of abortion legislatively since the Dobbs case overturned Roe versus Wade and returned the issue of abortion to the states. So our governor called a special session to take up a tax refund, but then also asked the legislature to take up the life issue. And so for the last 2 weeks, we've been at the statehouse. It has been a long but fascinating 2 weeks as the Indiana legislature has debated this issue, maybe fought over this issue, would be another descriptor. And while all of that's kind of fresh in my mind, I wanted to share with you 3 lessons, kind of 3 observations from this process as you promote the sanctity of life in your sphere of influence. Now, if you're new to the podcast, maybe you have a different view of the life issue. Here at the Good Citizen Podcast, our view is that the sanctity of life is a pre-political biblical belief that we are created in the image of God, and therefore we are of equal dignity, of equal worth. From conception to natural death, we should be protected by our laws. And so I wanted to bring some of these lessons to you, in the sense that you'll be promoting these in your sphere of influence. And there have been elected officials from other states. I know at least one that was here yesterday. But then many are kind of watching from around the country, like, okay, you guys go first, and we'll see what happens. We'll hopefully learn some lessons. So I want to bring some of these observations to you. Now, a little bit of background and kind of where the bill is. I think as you're listening to these lessons, you'll need to know some of this if you haven't been tracking it. I understand it is summer; people have other things to do. So, kind of the status of Indiana abortion law, and then some of the key provisions or issues in the bill. Indiana had a 20-week ban, and then restrictions on abortion. In the case of you couldn't discriminate or choose to abort because of a baby's race or sex or disability. We also had fetal remain laws that if a baby was aborted, that baby actually had to be buried or cremated, given the honor of a human burial. So that was the basic state of the law coming into this, and then the Senate led with a bill which was an abortion ban, and so it wasn't a 15-week ban like the Mississippi law at issue in Dobbs, nor was it a heartbeat bill like the one in Texas, but rather an actual ban. Now there was some conversation because generally we talk about conception. The bill defined this more along the lines of implantation at first, so there was a discussion over all of that. But some of the key issues in the bill, because of course a legislature could set out to say, all right, we're going to ban abortion, but then what are your terms and what are the kind of technical details of this to make sure that it actually accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish with the legislation. And so a few things that certainly came up in the discussion. The first one was just the definition of abortion. And of course, the reason this is important is because you want to make sure something like a miscarriage or an ectopic pregnancy doesn't fall into the abortion definition. You're not saying that a woman that's having a miscarriage, you are doing that. You're in the same category there. So there was some conversation about a term called a lethal fetal anomaly, and this would be where a doctor would certify that it is not likely that a baby is going to survive outside of the womb due to developments like not having certain organs or having a certain disease or genetic condition. And the reason why this is a tough issue is that, and you may even know of someone in your family, I know of anecdotes from just my circle of friends of doctors saying this and then either not being true or that medical technology continues to increase. And so these individuals with a quote unquote lethal fetal anomaly might actually be able to survive outside of the womb. I think of Bob Vanderplatz in Iowa, and he's been on the podcast, and he and Darla's son, Lucas, who was given just a very short time to live outside the womb, lived for several decades. I believe he was in his late 20s and 30s when he passed away. And they talk so often about how he taught them more about Jesus than they ever taught him. And so you think about those situations. And so there was actually a state rep that took to the podium that talked about how he or his father would have been a lethal fetal anomaly case. And that if this law was in effect, he wouldn't have been there because his father could have been aborted. That was certainly a powerful testimony, but that definition did stay in. Of course, these are difficult and tough topics, and I often share with pastors that we, as church leaders, even committed Christians, get to kind of debate and philosophize about these issues, but legislators have a green button and a red button, and they have to choose one or the other. Another issue that came up, which is certainly something many listeners would be aware of, is an exception for the ban on abortion for the life of the mother. So this is essentially a self-defense type of argument that, all right, if the mother has a baby in the womb, but the baby is in some way going to risk her life, is going to take her life. Maybe it's a cancer situation. Maybe it's where the baby is, something along those lines, and a doctor certifies this pregnancy will kill you. Indiana law would include this type of exception. Such a difficult conversation. But one of the concerns is that definition, like what would justify that? And so there's some specific language in Indiana code which sets all this out. But one of the concerns is if life of the mother is so broad that it could even include something like just mental health. And a woman just saying, well, I would be depressed if I have a baby. That language would be so broad that it would justify almost any abortion. And so some of that language at the very beginning of this process was somewhat vague, and that has been corrected and strengthened at this point. Of course, another issue is the rape and incest exception, perhaps the most difficult conversation often used by those that are proponents of abortion. As you start talking about this, they almost automatically jump into, well, what about rape and incest? And so that was a really tough conversation. I actually listened to about a 5-hour debate in our Senate on this issue. And if you remember, there's a story about a 10-year-old young girl who was raped. There was a pregnancy as a result of that rape, and she was brought from Ohio over into Indiana. And so that conversation was front and center. And certainly we have every sympathy for either a young woman or any woman that has been a victim of rape. But then the conversation on the other side is that the baby is an innocent third party, that they did not do that, and that an abortion isn't a treatment for rape. It doesn't solve the trauma of that. And so killing the child would not be something that Indiana should support. So this was the debate kind of back and forth, and the rape and incest exception has stayed in at this time. And then one last issue that was of note is that there are prosecutors in different places in the country that have vowed they would not enforce an abortion law. Governor DeSantis from Florida is actually in the news last night and today for basically just relieving someone of their duties, a particular prosecutor, over this issue. And so that was a concern here. And in fact, we had a prosecutor who publicly said he would not enforce any abortion ban. And so the state legislature has put together a prosecutorial task force to oversee that issue. So again, just a bit of a foundation there, just saying here's kind of where the law is at this point. Today, the House will take up what's called the third reading. Every bill has 3 readings. We'll take up the third reading and is expected probably to pass that. And then the Senate might concur with it. So again, this process may be done today, which is Friday, August 5th, or it may go into early next week. So again, there's kind of a foundation there. I wanted to tell you where the law is, and maybe that would help as I talk through some of these lessons. All right, so 3 lessons or observations from this process. Some of them, my ears are still ringing from some of the screaming in the statehouse. So these are all fresh. But the first one I would mention is that this debate, or this fight in a sense, has been theological. Now, as I start this, I did want to make clear that the arguments used and the reason that the law has been proposed in the state of Indiana is because the medical evidence clearly shows that life begins at conception, that this is a life. And even the Dobbs case shows that a state can have a rational basis for passing a law that protects the life of the unborn. And that is the core of the reason this law is being passed. So what I mean by the fact that it's theological is that both sides in this debate have consistently talked about theological arguments in their statements, certainly in the protesters outside of the chamber. And in this observation, I'm primarily coming from my perspective as a pastor, and it's a very simple observation, and that is when you're talking about things like the life of the unborn, like the choice of a young woman that is sitting there saying, do I terminate a pregnancy, or do I bring this baby to term as is currently allowed under Indiana law up to 20 weeks? And so when you're talking about these issues, it's just inescapable that you fall back on some form of morality, on some world view. And certainly now that the Lemon test has been kicked out to some degree, of basically ended by the Coach Kennedy case, I think it makes a lot of sense, because in this particular argument, everyone's worldview is exposed. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. And so I'll start on certainly kind of the pro-life side. As many state senators and state reps in conversations with others, even in some of their testimony on the floor, just stating that they're one of the reasons that they support this is a belief that that unborn baby is made in the image of God, and that they should be protected. And so certainly some of those arguments, and there were some very eloquent, well-stated speeches. I thought some very courageous stands taken by some of the elected officials on that side of it. And certainly they would also note that medical evidence establishes that life begins at conception. But the thing that surprised me, and it probably shouldn't have, is that a number on the side that was opposing the abortion ban relied on explicitly theological arguments, often even from the floor, just saying things like, I've been to Sunday school, I have a relationship with Jesus, I love God, and that's why I want to support a woman's right to choose. And so it was just interesting, kind of fascinating to me, that in this debate, you couldn't fall back on just, well, economic arguments, or I just think this is in the best interest of someone. No, they were specific moral language. Or so at least, if maybe it's not theological, at least was a strong moral conversation about, well, what is right, what is wrong. There was very little relativism going on at the State House over the last 2 weeks, in the sense of, well, there's really no standard, and everybody just needs to be able to do what they can, what they think is right. No, it is right to support a woman's right to choose, or it is right to protect the baby in the womb. And so that fascinated me. And that was just some of the conversations from the legislators. And then one other really fascinating part of this is the argument raised by those supporting the right of a woman, or the choice of a woman to terminate a pregnancy. They brought up a religious liberty claim. And the basic idea is certainly particular Jewish sects, SECTS, would claim that a human being's life, like a human doesn't become a person, a fetus doesn't become a person until that person takes their first breath. And so they were arguing for a religious liberty protection to end a pregnancy, to end a life, up until a person takes breath. That appeared to be the argument that was being made, which was fascinating to me, in the sense that for so long it's very relativistic. This is just a right to privacy. This has nothing to do with faith, and so it's fascinating that those that were opposed to the abortion ban were bringing up this issue. Now, of course, with religious freedom, I am a huge proponent of religious freedom, but I recognize its limits, and in the sense that my religious liberty does not entitle me to take an innocent life. And think back through the church's history, the Crusaders would have been helpful to them to be mindful of this idea that religious liberty means we have a soul liberty, but it does not give us the right to take another innocent human life. So this was a fascinating conversation. Had some legislators that know me even talk to me about this issue. And so that was also interesting. And so the big point here, if you're listening to this for the first time, or you're just a new listener, I'm not saying that anyone made or brought up these issues improperly. I'm saying that everyone made theological / moral arguments, because this issue is inescapably moral. It's inescapably, I would argue, theological. And it forces you to come back to what is your source of right and wrong. And nobody's just saying, well, we think it's a good idea. Like, there's no moral relativism going on. It shows that there's a facade of neutrality when it comes to arguments saying, well, this is secular, it has nothing to do with morality or faith. I know everybody was saying this is a moral, and I would even argue religious issue. Here's what's right, here's what's wrong. On one side, on the life issue, saying you must protect the right of the unborn. On the other side is you must give the right of the woman to choose, so she's not forced, the forced birth type of argument, which I'll get into a little bit later. And then the last kind of proof of this, and I say this to the end because I wanted to confirm that there were many arguments brought up by those on the pro-choice side by very sophisticated, by very intelligent, very well-spoken individuals that were pursuing a civil conversation. And one of the interesting things about a state senate, about a state house, is it may be one of the last kind of controlled environments where the speaker has a gavel. And if you're out of order, you start calling somebody a name, they'll often gavel you out. And so there's a forced civil conversation. And so I wanted to start there to say, people of good faith saying, here's what I believe, not screaming at someone. But on the outside of the chamber was a different story, in that throughout the last 2 weeks, people just screaming, yelling. And I know this is an emotional issue, but in support of my premise that this was a theological argument, I'm just going to share with you, what was on signs, and not just a few signs, but all over the place. And be mindful, Dobbs had nothing to say about, all right, here's what the Christian church believes about abortion. It just simply said the U.S. Constitution does not contain this right, and the state should take it up. And so, in defense of my premise that this was a theological debate, there were so many signs having to do with faith or with God, and so many of the chants had to do with the same thing. So a couple of examples: keep your rosaries off our ovaries. All right, that was repeated over and over and over again outside of the chamber. Another one, 2468, separate church and state. All right, so another argument: keep your morality out of this. But then also a sign, keep your God off my bod. All right, that was the sign I saw last night. But then another sign held by an individual, and again, I'm not demeaning these individuals, I'm just kind of noting the theological aspect of their arguments. This one just read, Jesus killed his son, therefore we should be able to abort our babies. And I reviewing that, my first kind of thought was, well, maybe I'm grateful he's not biblically literate enough to blaspheme accurately. But mercy, I mean, that's this sign simply doesn't understand the gospel. It was an anti-gospel, basically. That Jesus came, he died, he sacrificed for us, and this is saying that young woman at any point could just end a pregnancy because it's not the right time of life for it. And so that one gets my blood up a little bit. But so many of the arguments and just conversations back and forth between Christians and others were theological in nature. And so that's something to note about this debate. As much as our society, and here's the big idea, as much as our society has tried to scrub religion out of the public square, saying that it has no place here, it was just fascinating to me, and this is not a criticism, it's an observation, that both sides in this debate were relying on often theological or at least quasi-religious moral arguments to say, here's what's right, here's what's wrong in this conversation. One kind of last corollary on this point is that I also saw, and I'll just be blunt, I saw scripture used and misused terribly in this debate. And one of the things I've been saying for a long time is that if the church does not disciple people on their role as or in their role as citizen, someone else will. And this is especially extends to public theology and the interpretation of scripture. I heard all sorts of arguments, so even like one of about David and Bathsheba and God, that child dying, and basically a statement that God killed that child, therefore rape and incest exception is okay. I'm just back there like, oh my goodness, like we need to rightly divide the word of truth. Um, and again, I defer to those that are in that space. I know they're making difficult arguments, but I do think certainly in the province of an interpretation of scripture, we need to do that properly. So again, I wanted to spend a little bit of time there, give you some examples, but that is one of my key lessons. This issue is inescapably theological, or at least moral. Nobody's coming in here saying there's no right and wrong. We'll do whatever we want. It is no. Here's what's right. Here's what's wrong. I think that's important for us to understand as we head into these conversations around the country. All right, the second one second observation that I would make is that it is not over. So the first observation about Indiana's abortion debate, the abortion debate generally, is that it's theological, inescapably theological. There's no moral relativism going on here. The next one is that it's not over. And I suppose most Christians didn't like sit down and rationally think, all right, Dobbs puts the issue back to the states, and therefore the abortion issue is over. We all know that it's going back to the states, and each state is going to be different. But I will admit that there was at least a hope. I don't think an assumption, but at least a hope, feeling that, all right, if this issue is kind of brought back to the states, that we've come so far on teaching our culture or equipping people in our culture to understand the sanctity of life, that if the issue goes back to the people, that, and it's not just a group of judges making this decision, that life will be protected and that people are going to value life, and it's going to be a winning proposition. Well, over the last couple of days, even out of Kansas, where there was a public vote on this issue, and the people of Kansas voted in favor of the pro-choice position. And then here in Indiana, what has been interesting, Indiana has a Republican supermajority, generally the party that supports sanctity of life. However, this was not an open and shut conversation, and that there were those in leadership in both houses that are making some very difficult choices, but that did not just go over to groups like Indiana Right to Life and say, what do you want? And in fact, in some of the rape and incest exception conversation, that in the pro-life movement, there's a consensus that, well, as there's certainly terrible trauma for the woman, but this is a life, this is a baby that's innocent and should be protected. That did not pass, even in a state like Indiana. And some of the more conservative groups that had kind of, here's a proposed bill, just pass this, were basically not allowed, not in the conversation about the original draft of this bill. And then there were party line votes on some of these difficult issues that I've mentioned, like the rape and incest exception, the life of the mother, all of those sorts of things. And so here's my point. And it is that I, again, kind of assumed that if all of this was put back to the state, at least in a number of the states that are more conservative, that this was going to be very open and shut, that everybody's on the same page. Hey, let's get this done. But I am sobered by what has happened here, and also seeing a little bit about what's going on around the country. And I should have known this, but I'm a hopeful realist, so I do hope at times, and then reality smacks me in the face. All right, but that we still have much work to do. It's not over, is the point. It's not over in the sense that this argument is going to go on, and 30 years from now, I hope at some point maybe we're able to win hearts and minds to such a degree that, like slavery, we don't have a conversation about the morality of slavery anymore. Everybody knows that somebody made the image of God, therefore they should be protected. But the argument isn't over, and so we need to continue to lean in to this issue with our neighbors, And that's, again, the vote from Kansas, even what happened here, is that we need to continue to, through our lives, through our efforts, we need to be promoting this concept. And there was a lady here this week that is actually, I was joking with her, like, did you sleep in the statehouse every night? Because she's been there at the statehouse every day, with a beautiful story about how now, I mean, it's a tragic but then beautiful story, a redemption story, where she had actually been raped by a family member at the age of 13. And at the time, she didn't know what an abortion was. And so she was referred to a doctor named Dr. Klopfer, who in Indiana is notorious, had an abortion mill, botched all sorts of abortions. But she went there, had an abortion. She became pregnant at the age of 16 with a boyfriend, not a product of rape. They decided to keep that baby, and actually had the chance to meet her and her husband, as they were both there to share their story. They had that baby, other children, but when she had a miscarriage, they described that it was kind of a double grief. She had never grieved that original abortion, and that abortion, the grief from that abortion at age 13, almost destroyed their marriage, almost destroyed this woman's life. She lives with that grief every day. Now she's given it to Jesus. They now lead a ministry to women and to men who are grieving abortion, the men grieving lost fatherhood. And so she was there to share her story. There was another woman there that she just had a sign that simply read, "I was conceived in rape. I love my life." It had a picture of her. She said, "I love my family." It had a picture of her husband and her kids. And she says, "I love my grandkids," a picture of her with her grandkids. And she's basically to say, look, if this is law, I may not have had a chance at life. And so continuing to make this argument, don't put it down. That's my observation. That's my lesson. Even in places where we think, oh, this is something we've won, and we can now kind of move on to other pursuits. No, the argument's not over. We need to continue to lean in and to share with people why this is true and good. And so the argument's not over. Also, the process is not over. We recognize, even as this special session comes to a close, that we're back in January, and this is going to be an issue. Many states are trying to put this issue on the ballot or pursuing this through the Supreme Court. So if, it seemed like Dobbs was a milestone, but as we've been talking about, it really was just the starting line of a new race. All right. And one that's going to be fought in every state for years to come. And so that's not over. It's not, the argument's not over. The process isn't over. And then I would say that the problem isn't over. And here's what I mean by that. I was fascinated to listen to arguments. And what I try to do on this podcast is to represent people's arguments objectively, accurately, and to just hear their arguments. And it was the forced pregnancy, the forced birth argument really fascinates me, because they talk about there'd be individuals that come to the podium to say things like, you're forcing this young woman to give birth to a child. She has no option to abort this child. And a little tongue in cheek here, okay? But it's not like we're a new species, and we have no idea where human babies come from, right? And that it comes back to our society's view on human sexuality, that sleep with whoever you want as long as they consent to your advances. No rules, no restrictions on that. You should be absolutely free. Freedom, all right? The ultimate freedom. We talk about the differing views of freedom being this open license to do whatever you want, rather than ordered liberty to build your life according to God's good design. And that's really the core of it. And what's interesting is, because of the nature of this debate, no one really can talk about that. And it's kind of the emperor has no clothes argument. Like, and certainly in some of the cases, I remember some of the judges talking about this, and one of the issues that came up in the Dobbs case, I believe especially Amy Coney Barrett brought this up, that, we do have adoptions. We do have these safe haven baby boxes, which we talked about last week, but nobody can actually talk about, well, what if our social mores around human sexuality are out of order? And that's what's leading to so much of this. But of course, that can't be talked about. And so this will not be over as long as our views on human sexuality the way that they are right now, and we can't admit that there's an issue. And there was one other aspect of this debate. Again, I'm trying to just represent the arguments that I've heard, and that is things like, well, 80% of women, even 80% of women that are raped, certainly 80% of women, I believe it's 80% of women that are raped, even they will continue their pregnancies. And then there was the argument about those that are in a lower social economic class, that if a woman becomes pregnant, that most of them will continue to have that baby. And the argument was, well, if that's the case, and they're born into this lower social economic class, that there may not be good mother to child bonding, that they're probably going to be hungry. They may in fact be in a situation where they're victims, and so they're just not going to have a good life. And I'm sitting there like, well, why don't we ask these people if they'd rather have a few struggles or whether they'd like to be dead? I mean, it's just again, I'm being a little tongue in cheek, but it's just like there's like, you can't even talk about that. Like, that's an actual life, that's an actual person, and let's maybe ask them if they'd like to have a chance at life rather than making the decision for them. And so I say all of that to just say that it's not over. That this, Dobbs pushing it back to the states, I think we all knew this. I've certainly I had some hope that maybe as the issue came back to the people, that there'd be more traction, that it would be easier, maybe might be my thought. And it is not that. It certainly had, at least my experience here over the last 2 weeks has shown me that there's still much, much work to be done. And then the last thing I would say is that it's an opportunity. So I would say that first, it's theological. Second, I would say that it's not over. And thirdly, I say that it's an opportunity, in the sense that it's an opportunity to have conversations with individuals about a key issue of morality that certainly points back to a creator, that points back to a higher power. I mean, when you're talking about tax policy, all right, let's talk about tax policy. Let's talk about what's best. As I mentioned already, you can't do that in this debate. This is about ultimate sources of truth and one of the most difficult, complex, personal issues that has, real life implications. But it's a really difficult conversation, inescapably moral, inescapably theological. And so it's an opportunity to talk about the giver of life. And as we've been at the statehouse, we've had pastors up to pray with their legislators, to just encourage them. And we're nonpartisan, so we've done our best to meet with both Democrats and Republicans and have conversations about these issues, what's going on, primarily just to encourage and to pray for them. But this is an opportunity to have these conversations, and certainly having conversations with people that see this differently can be tough. But it's an opportunity to have open conversations, civil conversations about what's best. And something happened this week that especially kind of drove this home, that it is an opportunity. And as you may be aware, that Jackie Walorski, U.S. Congresswoman from the state of Indiana, was killed in a car accident. And there were a number of legislators here that live in her congressional district or near it, were mentored by her, were good friends with her. And just seeing them as they were just already going through all of the life issue and the debate, the rancor around this issue, and then to have that kind of pushed on their shoulders as well. And it just reminded us reminded us all of the brevity of life, but also the importance of life, of the difference that just one person can make in so many different people. And so again, this has taught me the three lessons from Indiana's abortion debate / fight, is that it is an opportunity for people of faith to talk to others about the importance of a moral code, of a worldview, of the importance of life, and the importance of eternal life. And so don't miss that opportunity in your sphere of influence. We've had, I have lost count at this point of the number of reps and legislators reps and senators we've been able to just talk with, pray with, encourage them as they are taking up this really important issue. And in fact, for many of them, perhaps the most important issue they will ever vote on in their position. The other opportunity I was thinking about as I was sitting there, my ears are still ringing from some of the chants of, my body, my choice, 2468, separate church and state, that sort of thing. It is the opportunity I hinted at, talked about a little bit last week, and that the law is a teacher, that the gospel certainly transforms lives. It is what transforms lives. But the law is a teacher. It informs our consciences about what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And one of my reflections this week has just been how so many individuals, as we've taught our society for now more than or almost 50 years, that you don't have to consider this other person. You don't have to consider the baby in this equation. And now when the law says, actually, no, that's a baby. Science shows it, medicine shows it. That's a baby. That's another human being. That's not your body. That's the baby's body. You have to consider that. That the like being told that when the law has formed your conscience a different way can be jarring, shocking. Like what do you mean that you're now going to pass a law that reflects that? And so when human law reflects God's law, when human law reflects eternal law, that's what leads to flourishing. When our society is aligned with God's principles, the creator of us, the creator of human flourishing, who has set out kind of this template for human societies to say, here's, if you follow my laws, it leads to flourishing. If you don't, it's going to lead to complications, as we're seeing in our society now. And so I think this is a remarkable opportunity for the church to be the moral voice. As MLK says, the church isn't the master, the servant of the state. Rather, it's the conscience of the state. And so if we don't stand up on this issue, then what good? What good is our faith? What good are our sermons about the sanctity of life? What good is our morality? And we often talk about the abolitionists, and we all think, well, if I was back there when slavery was around, I'd be an abolitionist. I would stand up to it. Well, I think it's pretty easy to say that if you won't stand up and say something about the sanctity of life, that's a person made in the image of God. They should at least have life. I don't think you would have been standing up against slavery either. I say that to myself as well. All right, that I think we need to take this opportunity. It's an opportunity to be the conscience to the state, the conscience to our society. It's hard, yes. People will accuse you of things, yes, but it's important and it's right. I'll close with this. I was just praying and thinking yesterday through some things on how could I be an encouragement to legislators. What verse might I be able to share? And the one that came to mind was just Micah 6:8. It says, as you know, he showed you a man what is good. What does the Lord require thee? But to do justly, the three things, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God, with thy God. And the reason I was thinking about this verse is just for all of us to think about this national development, how important it is just that this life is protected, given the opportunity to live. But there's so much going on in our society. The Supreme Court cases, now there are state cases, and if you live in Kansas, they've just voted to make this a part of your constitution. There's so much going on, and you think, well, what are my constituents? If an elected official is thinking about what do my constituents require me? Pastor's thinking, what do the people in the pews require of me? Many of us are thinking, well, what can I do? I mean, I'm just one person. And why this verse encouraged me is just a simple thought. What does God require of us? He does not require us to get the victory. Like when we stand before him, the question will not be, did you pass legislation, ban abortion? How many lives did you save? It isn't results. It's rather faithfulness. And so what does God require of us? To do justice and to love mercy, to walk humbly with God, to do everything that we can in our context. And then at the end of the day, we leave it up to the King of the nations, who's moving all things according to his will, and we can rest in that. So I found great encouragement from that verse over the last 2 weeks that, look, yes, we need to be doing everything, absolutely everything physically possible to make a difference on these issues. But at the end of the day, we rest in the Lord. We pray to him that he would intervene to protect the least of these. And so those are a couple of lessons from the last couple of weeks, a bit of stream of consciousness, but I wanted to get that to you while it is fresh in my mind, fresh ringing in my ears. All right, so 3 thoughts it's certainly theological. And I'm not saying improperly so, that all people that come to this, it is theological, it is moral. You can't escape that this is right, this is wrong. Those are the claims. There's no moral relativism here, that it's not over, that we need to double down to say, look, we still have a lot of work to do to convince those in our society that this is true, that it isn't just something that helps people win an election if you say you're pro-life, but why do you believe it and how deeply do you believe it? We have a lot of work to do there. And also just reminding our society about God's design concerning human sexuality. That's the basis of this. That's the problem, the foundation of it. And we have a lot of work to do on that as well. And finally, it is an opportunity for us to talk about what the Bible says is good and true. This is our opportunity to be the conscience of our society. So I hope you'll be able to take those lessons and apply them in your context. 3 lessons or thoughts from our abortion debate here in Indiana.